The threat posed by North Korea will be a topic when Presidents Trump and Putin meet on Friday. Now, Elaine, we also know that a U.S. proposal to collaborate with Russia to end that bloody war in Syria will also be a key focus.
Well, Margaret, what can we expect from that meeting between President Putin and President Trump?
It really isn't clear. There's not a lot of time scheduled for it. This will be the first face-to-face meeting, and we know that inside the room it'll be a very closed circle of aides. What is interesting is that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson will be sitting beside the president. It will be only him, his Russian counterpart, Trump, Putin, and their two translators. And so what that means here is that this is going to be a highly focused meeting in many ways, but we also know that Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, or the current Secretary of State, who's also the former CEO of Exxon, has spent decades not only doing business in Russia, but dealing with Putin himself. So there is a skilled hand in there, though President Trump himself is really learning how to be a diplomat on the job.
Yeah, interesting dynamic there. Well, President Trump had dinner with South Korea's President Moon and Japan's Prime Minister Abe. They're likely discussing, of course, North Korea's latest missile launch, but noticeably absent is China's President Xi Jinping. Why isn't he being included, and how could that impact the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, it's not really that unusual for China to be left out of a meeting between military allies, right? They're not part of a military alliance that the U.S. has, a pact there to come to the defense of Japan, to come to the defense of South Korea. We share intelligence, we share military planning, and we have U.S. troops in those countries. So it's sort of standard fare for the three parties to sit down and plan a response. But the fact that we're not seeing at this point in tensions with North Korea any kind of cross collaboration with China is significant, because despite what we have heard from President Trump regarding his own frustration, saying, well, we had to try and look, China's not, the plan to work with China just isn't working out for us, he doesn't really have any option that doesn't in some way lead him to talk and have to reach out to Beijing, because they are the prime financial lifeline for that otherwise economically troubled regime in Pyongyang led by Kim Jong-un. So while China is not bending to the will at this point of what the U.S. president has asked them to do, which is something that they fear would destabilize North Korea, they still have some ability here to block the U.S. from, say, rolling out new international sanctions at the UN. And so President Trump in some way has to get Xi Jinping to come to some sort of agreement that they see the same level of threat. And at this point, the immediate threat the U.S. describes is not looked at in the same way from Beijing.
Well, the G-20 also marks the president's first meetings with world leaders since pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, a move almost universally criticized by our allies. How's the president being received in Hamburg?
Well, we had thousands, tens of thousands of protesters here in the city, but they aren't specifically anti-Trump protests by any means, though there is a strain of frustration among many of them in regard to climate policies. And so the groups that we've seen on the streets here have really been pushed to the outskirts of the city, and they are very much leftist, very radical groups in some respects. Some people who are just protesting out of what they see as their concern here in regard to trade policy, in regard to frustration with the establishment and capitalism. We've really seen a smattering of different groups here on the streets of Hamburg. But what we know is that inside the rooms, when President Trump is meeting with world leaders, he already met with Chancellor Angela Merkel miles away from here, they are also getting a level of frustration from European leaders, including the Chancellor, including the French president, about the U.S. pulling out of that international agreement. So while President Trump is here in Europe for the second time since he was elected, he is in many ways sort of striking a do-over He said the right things, quote unquote, in terms of the European allies getting the reassurances on NATO. He didn't necessarily say the right things on climate from their perspective. So over the next few days, we may hear more. Can the U.S. strike some sort of agreement that not only mends some of these, perhaps damaged relationships, rebuilds that trust, and says that the U.S. will stand by its other international agreements?
All right, Margaret Brennan in Hamburg for us. Margaret, thanks.